Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervert's Guide to Computer Programming Languages. My name is Wavell Watson. I'm with a consultancy here in town called the Volt Cooperative. If you want to talk with me about that, I can give you some more information later. I've got some good news and some bad news today. The good news is that this talk is not about sexual deviancy. The bad news is, if you get up and leave now, we will all know that you were here for the sexual deviancy. So think about that when you get up to go to the bathroom or whatever. Of course, I'm just joking. All right. Some of the issues with selecting a programming language, and this is going to be drinking from a fire hydrant, by the way. So I'm going to be going very quickly because there's a lot of material to cover. What are the issues with selecting a programming language? Well, which programming language should we choose? And just saying use the right tool for the job begs the question. I hate it when people say that. Why are there over 1,000 programming languages, and how do we critique a programming language? Well, in order to get into that, we need to kind of dissect how we make decisions in the first place. So why do language designers create programming languages? There are some rational reasons: maximizing expression while modeling maybe a specific problem or a broad range of problems. Well, psychoanalysts have said many decisions are not rational, right? So maybe programming languages, the choice of which can be rational, non-rational, or a mix between the two. What we're going to do today is use Jacques Lacan and Slava Jezik's critical theory to critique the non-rational portion of your programming language choice. We're going to discover some ulterior motives, both ours and others, and we're going to try to explain the diversity of language options. Some learning objectives today: we're going to learn the fundamentals of Lacanian and Jezikian critical theory. After this talk, you should be able to read Jezik without pulling your hair out. We're going to apply the fundamentals of critical theory to your favorite programming language, and we'll possibly start a holy war, but I contend that if you use these tools, you can actually use them to stop a holy war. So we're going to go through a very quick introduction to psychoanalysis. First up is Jacques Lacan. He's a French psychoanalyst and philosopher. He's extremely cryptic. Some would say impenetrable. He's preoccupied with desire and enjoyment, popularized the mirror image, big other, and the triad of imaginary, symbolic, real. He believes all humans fall into three basic mental structures of psychosis, perversion, and neurosis. And by the way, for this talk, there's a paper associated with it that on the link. And at the end of the slide, you can follow the link, and I have like 70 references for everything I have in here. So if you're interested, you can look things up. Next up is Slava Jezik. He's a student of Jacques Lacan, specializes in ideology, and his most influential work is The Sublime Object of Ideology. He makes very politically incorrect jokes, and he's a critic of political correctness, so you probably should expect that, but he's very politically incorrect, and he does it on purpose. And it's actually not just to be provocative, it's to actually try to get you introduced to his description of what ideology is. He believes our ideological symptoms and fantasies form in order to help us deal with antagonism. So why the Pervert's Guide? All right, it's based on the Pervert's Guide to Ideology. It's a film by Slava Jezik. He does not tell you why he calls it the Pervert's Guide in the film, so I'm going to tell you why here. A pervert is a person who enjoys being a vessel of the rules. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Jezik calls the analyst's method of discourse the pervert's discourse. The analyst sits in the position of the object of desire for the subject. We're going to talk a lot about that today. The analysand, which is the client, projects his or her ideals onto the analyst in a process known as transference. So when we analyze programming languages, we are operating in the analyst or pervert's discourse. So that's where the name comes from. Why psychoanalysis isn't psychoanalysis complete BS? Well, psychoanalysis in some senses is outdated model of mind, outdated therapy. Now we use drugs to solve things. Outdated view of sexual repression. We are much more sexually permissive now than 100 years ago. And computer science tries to demonstrate a computational account of the brain, which kind of leaves no room for psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is largely questioned here in the United States. In Europe, it's held in a higher regard, though. Lacan actually updates Sigmund Freud's view of psychoanalysis. He uses speech act theory, Hegelian philosophy, and what we talked about before, the fundamental structures of psychosis, neurosis, and perversion. He kind of updates them from Sigmund Freud, the Lacanian triad again. And then he has a controversial belief that psychoanalysis is not for increasing your well-being. It's actually for explaining reality. The basis of Lacanian psychoanalytic structures is speech act theory. In order to understand that, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about structuralism and post-structuralism. A structure is a privileged and necessary concept at the center of a model of human understanding. All right, so Jezik believes Lacan holds that the performative and reflexive elements of the speech act are necessary and privileged. That's a controversial position. The post-structuralists actually think Lacan is a post-structuralist and all kinds of different things, but Jezik definitely believes he's a structuralist. Why does that matter? Well, does it matter? It's because maybe if you're going to deny Lacanian theory or deny what I'm going to talk about today, you'll probably do it here. But what's not in question is that Lacan actually believes early speech acts have an overwhelming effect on us, and that's why we're using him today. So why do we need psychoanalysis? Well, my argument is just as you should take other people's rational decisions into account when making your decisions, you should take other people's irrational decisions into account when making your decisions. So in this way, psychoanalysis is kind of like strategy or game theory or decision theory. And those game theory takes other people's rational decisions and tries to model them. And then psychoanalysis you can use to model irrational decisions. And when I'm talking about irrational decisions today, I'm talking about those decisions that go against your conscious preferences. All right, so now we're going to get into the Lacanian model, a little bit about enjoyment. So what is enjoyment or jouissance? Jouissance is an ambiguous French word that for enjoyment of rights, property, or oddly enough, sexual orgasm. Lacan uses jouissance to describe a person's relationship with the object of desire. We're going to be talking a lot about that today. Lacan's use is it's kind of related to Freud's death drive. You may have heard of the sex drive, but you may not have heard of the death drive. And a good example of that would be a child's game of peekaboo. Sigmund Freud was kind of fascinated with what in German is called Freuda, where if you can imagine a child and the primary caretaker in the room for an extended period of time, it's fine. Primary caretaker leaves the room for an extended period of time, the child's distraught. But this weird thing happens where if the primary caretaker enters the room, leaves the room, enters again, the child actually experiences enjoyment. And this enjoyment is the enjoyment that comes from staging our own failure to reach the object of desire. All right, so enjoyment is confusing, so here's some things to remember. Enjoyment does not mean pleasure or happiness. That's your first paradox. It assumes that there's an object of desire. Okay, that's simple enough. The object of desire is not an actual physical object. All right, another paradox. All right, you can never reach the object of desire, but you can reach the target of desire, maybe a physical object, but this creates dissatisfaction. Another paradox, okay? There are rules that regulate the minimal distance between you and the object of desire. And if you violate those rules, maybe you'll contract some ailment like maybe depression or something like that. So the Lacanian structures, we mentioned psychosis, neurosis, and perversion. Within neurosis, you've got it separated into obsession and hysteria. Within perversion, you've got fetishism, masochism, and sadism. It's important to just kind of forget all the connotations you have for these words because he pours completely different nuanced meanings into them. They're not part of the traditional psychological DSM classifications the way he talks about them. So it can be very confusing when you're trying to read any Lacanian or Jezik because they use different terms. We are only going to be concerned about their effects on enjoyment today. Now, Lacan he kind of popularized the phrase the big other and the other within psychoanalysis. The other has this long, rich history within philosophy. But you may have heard the term when people are maybe talking about immigrants or racism or feminism, like othering someone. So here you can imagine the subject and the other. The subject is actually, in this example, would be like the child. And the other would be the primary caretaker, like the mother or something like that. The A is maybe something like a warm caress or the mother's breast or something like that. Now, Lacanian structures start in the early stages of a child's development. The child originally has no distinction between itself and the primary caretaker. There are two stages of prohibition, alienation and separation, and they regulate the difference or the space between the child and the object of desire. And those forms of separation, they're responsible for the three main categories of psychosis, perversion, or neurosis forming. Now we're going to get into psychosis. The first thing to remember, it's not about being a murderer, right? So that's one connotation that people kind of think of for a psychotic. The subject, psychotic, they never really properly separate from the primary caretaker. They never gain a normative relationship with language. And so one thing that Lacan believes is that a psychotic can't form original metaphors. But there is some studies that psychotics actually do have some problems with metaphors, and I have links to that in the paper. They experience delusions, voices, messages, stuff like that, engulfed in enjoyment. And a good example from Lacan of a functional, so you can have maybe a low functioning or dysfunctional psychotic, and you can have a high functional psychotic. A high functional psychotic would be James Joyce. Lacan believed that James Joyce, the author of Finnegan's Wake, was a psychotic, and he used his writing to kind of forestall maybe the bad parts of being a psychotic. So he's a very functional person. Now, for perversion, it doesn't mean creepy sexual behavior, right? It means a pervert wants to complete the rules. The pervert only experiences partial separation, so the first portion of the prohibitions, just the alienation from the primary caretaker. And the three substructures of perversion are fetishism, sadism, and masochism. We'll be talking a lot about them today. I think a good example of a pervert is the movie Borat, or maybe even Sacha Cohen himself, the way that he tries to display humor. There's an example within the movie Borat where there's two couples in the room, and for one couple, he says, okay, to the wife, he says, well, in my country, you would be considered beautiful. And then he points at the other wife and says, you, not so much. And it kind of popularized people saying not so much. Well, what he's trying to do is, the people in the room they weren't actors, they were real people. He's trying to create anxiety in them and actually in you and me, and trying to get us to announce the rules like etiquette. Okay, it doesn't matter that you're from a different country. It seems to us that you should know not to do that or something. And so this announcing of rules, that's kind of a hallmark of perversion. All right, so fetishism is not fascination with a sexual object necessarily. A fetish is an object that is linguistically related to the failure to name the primary caretaker's desire. Okay, the presence of the object relates or adds relief to the subject's unconscious by staging the naming of the desire of the caretaker. So if you want to imagine, probably everyone in this room, you have a fetishistic relationship with money. So if I were to take a $20 bill and hold it up, or you take a $20 bill, you know, and there's a formula for the fetish. It is, I know X, nevertheless Y. And I'm going to repeat that later. So for a $20 bill, you know that it is just ink and paper, all right? Nevertheless, what? If you were to cut the $20 bill in half or 60%, bring that to the bank, they will redeem it for you. You have this belief that a $20 bill or money is actually indestructible or incorruptible. You put properties onto it, and that's a fetishistic relationship. All right. So sadism, sadists what the common notion is a sadist enjoys giving people pain. Lacanian doesn't believe that they enjoy giving people pain. All right. So but they do seek, their strategy is to seek to cause anxiety in the victim. All right? They hope to force the victim to refine what they desire, and the refinement serves as proof for the sadist that the rules were announced. The classic example of a sadist is the antagonist in the film that ties the love interest to the train tracks. But they're trying to get you as the audience, the writer's trying to get you as the audience and the protagonist and everything to announce some type of rules, say something along the lines of maybe you envision yourself or what you would do in their position, or maybe what the protagonist should be doing. So there's a certain set of rules that you would announce. Masochism, they don't enjoy receiving pain. Rather, they actually, just like the sadist, they actually use a strategy of causing anxiety to the other, all right? But they do it by exposing themselves to pain. And then the other finds the event to be too much enjoyment, all right? So the other, at that point, they're provoked to announce the rules. A paradoxical example of a masochist is Marquis de Sade, where we get our word sadist or sadism from. Lacan actually believes he's a masochist because of certain relationships with women that he writes about. Now, for neurosis, a neurotic is not an abnormal person, according to Lacan, right? Actually, a neurotic is the majority of all humans, really. So neurosis is separated into obsession, hysteria, and phobia. We won't be talking about phobia too much today. They're preoccupied with what others think is right? They laboriously weigh the rules. That's a big part of what neurosis is. And as I said, a good example, according to Lacan, would be probably most people in the room. Now, obsession, not excessive repetition. It's not counting pins on the ground. It's not necessarily counting how many times you shut the door, right? The obsessive seeks to neutralize the other and possess the object of desire. The early speech acts cause the obsessive to forestall the encounter with the object of desire. So Jezik likes to say that obsessional activity is doing something in order to do nothing. And that's going to come up again later. They're primarily motivated by guilt from failing to adhere to the rules. And Hamlet, the Shakespearean play, is a classic example of the obsessive. Within Hamlet, you have the father being murdered, he dies, comes back as a ghost, and puts this big guilt trip on Hamlet. And Hamlet struggles with the guilt and trying to avenge the father, right? And he struggles all the way to the end of the play. But this wrestling with guilt is a hallmark of the obsessive person. Hysteria, now this is the one that I would say is probably the most controversial word. It's probably, if I could rename it, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I can't rename it. But hysteria, according to Lacan, it doesn't mean excessive emotion. It doesn't necessarily mean a woman. I'm going to give an example of a man here. What the hysteric wants is to be the object of desire, okay? So early speech acts cause the hysteric to move too fast towards the object of desire, and they overshoot it, all right? They keep the other unsatisfied using questions. So when you read Jezik, or any Lacanian, when they use the word hysteria or hystericize, to hystericize someone is to put them in this mode of being inquisitive or questioning, right? And the primary motivator is repulsion, especially at being possessed, right? So the classic examples, King Richard. The second is another Shakespearean play. King Richard goes through a process where he loses the crown. And then he starts questioning what it means to be a king, right? So he's questioning is it in the biology? Is it in the action of the king? Is it in the idea of what the subjects believe? Do the subjects make you a king? So it's a big part of definition of hysteria. Now we are going to get to applying this stuff to programming languages. All right, so we're going to use psychoanalytic enjoyment and Lacanian structures to critique the choice of computer programming languages. Programming languages use rules that lend themselves to specific structures, and any programming language is compatible with any structure. So if a hysteric uses an obsessional language, the hysteric will use the obsessive language like as if it was a hysteric language. Another thing to remember is the obsessional person or the obsessive person can have traits of another category. So an obsessive person can actually have traits of perversion. That would be pretty common, or even traits of hysteria and vice versa. So now we're going to get into the first controversial part for the programmers. Probably the first two parts might have been controversial for other people. So the psychotic languages, a psychotic or sociopath language does not laboriously weigh the rules before creating an end product, right? So psychotics don't laboriously weigh the rules, right? So I see people laughing already. The neurotics do laboriously weigh the rules. Psychotic languages have a poor method of abstraction. So if you can remember the language disturbances of the psychotic, they have problems with metaphors. They have problems with creating original metaphors or using existing ones properly. Weak or loose typing. So this is related to the rules, all right? And for the non-programmers, weak or loose typing or automatic implicit typecasting is if you can imagine this here, this example of what you learned in first grade arithmetic. You've got, adding 1 plus 1. What programmers call this portion right here is a string. And if you take a string or a word, right, and add it to another number, what is it that you get? Do you get a concatenation, which is 11, or do you get 2? Well, that's what loose typing is about. These kind of, maybe you have to know the idiomatic portions of the language to actually figure it out. And so that's a lack of rules within the typing system. So also, you've got the high-functioning psychotics or sociopaths. They have no internal implicit rules. So this might be convention, or it might be what you would think of as, programmers might think of as craftsmanship. Jezik says that a high-functioning psychopath, which is a sociopath, they follow the rules for goodness sake. They kind of don't follow the rules for goodness sake. They don't have an internal gut feeling of the rules. They do it just for the benefit of the rules. So that's a utilitarian definition. Okay. So now let's pick a little bit on PHP. All right. An interesting thing for the non-programmers, interesting thing about the community in PHP and outside of PHP, there's a saying, it's very hard to beat WordPress for what it does, okay? You install it, and then you modify it. Well, that's a utilitarian view, right? Within the community of PHP, you don't really see too often this communication about what an obsessive would care about, which would be maybe safety. So you've got maybe the Facebook programmer saying, okay, we're going to make this thing type safe and build a whole brand new version of PHP and try to make it more type safe. Or what I would call a hysteric, and we're going to learn about later, obsessive and hysteric. The hysteric will go to PHP and say, well, you guys don't have much beauty in your language. We're going to go ahead and bend your language so that it has these beautiful libraries within it. Okay, so they try to bend the language and use it in ways it probably wasn't designed to be used. And then you've got SQL. If you're an old school programmer from the 90s, there was this battle for the non-programmers. There's this battle between the programmers and the gatekeepers of the database, the DBAs. The DBA said, within the corporations, the DBA said, hey, you need to put all your business logic inside of store procedures. And the programmers kind of had this battle where they struggled to say why they didn't like that. Right? It's just an old way of doing things or something. But really what the problem was, poor method of abstraction, like we're talking about over here. So for SQL and store procedures, the means of abstraction, when I say means of abstraction, there's no good way to take primitive elements, combine them, and name them, and maybe hide information that's not useful to you. stored procedures didn't allow that, so that was they have a poor method of abstraction, and we don't, since maybe 2000 or so, people don't really put business logic in SQL. But it's very utilitarian, though. And then you have VBA, which is the language behind Excel, for instance. So Microsoft Excel. So when you have a problem with Excel and you Google the answer to the problem, you won't see somebody commenting about type safety or safety of the answer. You won't see them talking about this is an elegant answer. You will just find them saying, hey, here's the answer, a utilitarian answer. And so VBA would be a utilitarian and like high functioning psychopath language. So now, sorry for this wall of text. We're gonna talk about the perversion languages, and then I'm gonna review them on the next 2 slides, all right? So the masochists, they enjoy when the other announces that a hard problem must be solved with the masochist discipline, okay? They enjoy proving to the other that they have taken the hard road. Masochist languages are excruciatingly difficult, tedious, or minimalistic. And they cause anxiety by confronting the other with work done using syntax, architecture, or the tool chain. So we're going to contrast that with the sadist. The sadist threatens the other in such a way that the other will describe their own impotence, right? Masochist wants the other to describe the masochist discipline. The sadist wants the other to describe the other's impotence, all right? We're going to review that again. They use delivered code to cause anxiety by way of threat to the other, for example, through difficulty of maintenance. And then you've got the fetishist, which is a developer that finds enjoyment when a certain object is present. For example, first order abstraction. So a fetishistic kind of language, when they're describing their vocabulary, when they're describing a language, they'll say something along the lines of, our language has functions as a first order, or our functions are first order in our language, or objects are first order in our language. It's a primary abstraction that it's like kind of a go-to abstraction. We're going to talk about that again in the next couple slides. The more the fetishistic object is present, the more enjoyment it provides, and the presence of the fetishistic object stands in for the announcement of the rule. So now we're going to get into the perversion languages, and remember, the pervert enjoys being a vessel of the rules, all right? And also remember, the masochist wants the other to announce the masochist discipline. The sadist wants the other to announce the other's impotence, all right? So first, let's talk a little bit about factor. In order to talk about factor for the non-programmers, I'm going to have to describe the difference between infix, prefix, and postfix. Infix is what you remember from first grade arithmetic again. You've got 1 plus space, right? 1 space plus space 1, and your result 2, right? So in, as in the function or operator, is in the middle, right? Then you've got prefix, where the function is in the beginning. So plus space 1, and you get your answer 2. Most programming languages are prefix, or a combination of prefix and infix, but mostly prefix. Postfix is all of your parameters, so 1 space plus equals your answer 2. And the plus, the function or operator, is at the end, right? Now, the developer of factor, so that's postfix. Factor is postfix. The developer of factor says, hey, that's how my mind works. That's how I, like to do things. But there's some things you can do with factor or postfix languages, but factor in general, you can do things like manipulate the stack. You can do a different kind of programming where you use combinators and things like that. So it creates the situation where the person who develops in it, they have a certain discipline, but the programmer looks at it and says, you might be a JavaScript programmer. You don't believe that you're impotent, like what the sadist. You believe that the person that's doing that programming has a certain level of discipline. And besides the fact, most programmers that look at postfix, they want to jump out of a window, right? For the C, this is going to be pretty controversial. So for C, I'm going to use the example of Linus Torvalds. Linus Torvalds is the creator of the Linux operating system. And he says that C would be great if for no other reason, it got rid of the C++ programmers. okay? And so why does he say that, right? C++ is a new version of C. Should be that you use that, maybe, right? Well, what does he say about that? Well, he says the C++ programmers rely too much on the internal libraries of C++, the standard libraries, and they don't get memory management just right. And for the non-programmers, you've got, there's a saying within programming, there's only two hard things: naming something and memory management within programming. So what Linus actually likes when the C++ programmers look at the Linux kernel, see that it's done in C, and the memory management is done in C, and then they say, oh, I wish that I could use the libraries over here. They think he likes that he likes that they believe that the C++ or the C programmers have a large amount of discipline. And so, and that's why he chooses C. He doesn't believe that it has like some, extra capabilities or anything like that. So now we're going to get into machine language and assembler. I'll go into both of those together. Those languages are so hard to be productive with. To just do hello world in those two languages, you're going to need a certain level of discipline. Okay? So if someone does something in those languages, when the developer looks at it and they say, well, if nothing else, they have discipline, because I would use something else for that. All right, so there's a language called brainfuck, right? Just the name of that language alone should tell you that the designer of that language wanted you to experience anxiety, right? Okay, and if you were to look at the code, it's the terseness, the difficulty to understand it. It looks like the designer of the language is messing with you, right? But somebody that does something in that language, they have some discipline. You're crazy for doing something in that language. But you won't, as a programmer, you won't necessarily think you're impotent. You won't say, well, I have other languages in my toolbox that I can get anything done that you're doing in that language. But you will say, okay, that person's crazy or that person's really disciplined. Then you've got Ada, which is one of the languages I cut my teeth on. I believe it has excessive subtyping. You have the subtype to, integer in order to add two things together. I thought it was crazy, so definitely masochist to me, or bondage and discipline language. Now let's talk about the sadists, all right? So the first two languages that I want to get into, Regex and Perl, these two communities, it's the only community where they wear one-liners as a badge of honor. Okay? And when I say one-liners for the non-programmers, there's certain ways of code you can compress things into one line, and it's hard to understand, all right? But it actually does something you need to do. So for instance, for Regex, maybe email validation, email address validation. You're going to end up needing most likely to do or use a Regex for that. But if you're not someone that's familiar with Regex, you see this terse line, you see it, you have to use it, you feel like you have to level up. So you admit your impotence and you level up for Regex. Perl, I have a book on beautiful Perl. You don't have to use it as all one-liners. But it's interesting to note that community is within Perl. They do talk about the one-liners. And it's not something that's in a whole lot of other communities as a badge of honor. Then you've got Erlang. I was an Erlang programmer for a while. Erlang is interesting because the syntax comes from the 80s. There's periods at the end of the line for a function definition. It's a functional language, so when programmers aren't familiar with that, it doesn't have variables. And you say, well, how can I do anything with no variable? But that's one side. The other side is interesting with Erlang, is if you look as a developer, you look at the code, you see all this weird stuff. You see what they call supervision trees of processes watching other processes. You see that there's no error, oftentimes no error checking. Within Erlang, you just let stuff fail and you just restart it, right? And so within the Erlang community, you need all this stuff because Erlang developers pride themselves on making high availability systems. This is the only I'd say maybe the only community I know of where they say that they have systems that are 9 nines of availability. So that's 30 seconds downtime over 20 years, right? And so when you see that and you want high availability, the Erlang community, they like when you see this difficulty, this development, a way of doing development, and then you say, oh, I want the high availability. Well, I either have to succumb to this way of development, or they also like the fact that Erlang was kind of rewritten in Java in different libraries, like Akka is one library or what have you. They seem to enjoy that, and they talk about that a lot. Now, closure is what I call the ultimate perversion language. Within the closure community, it's interesting because when they say that they want to sell the language, the way you do it is you go to, within the corporate world, that you say, okay, you guys have a rule. You have to use Java. Well, closure is really just Java. So here's a jar file, right? So they're staying within the rules, right? And then that's what the pervert likes to do, stay within the rules, but play with the rules. And so they deliver this jar file. Okay, but then there's another side to it. With it, closure is very powerful, very expressive. There's metaprogramming in closure. A developer in closure might deliver some code that might be just 50 lines or 100 lines, and it might take you thousands of lines or impossible to do in Java. When the Java programmer looks at that, there's a certain amount of enjoyment that a closure programmer has with the Java programmer having to admit either impotence, well, I'm either going to have to rewrite this in thousands of lines of code, or I'm going to have to submit and actually learn closure, which is a kind of a, the syntax is not hard to learn, but to develop in it, it's a dialect of Lisp. There's lots of parentheses, and it kind of looks crazy to programmers who aren't familiar with it. So now we're going to get into the fetishistic languages. Remember, the fetishistic formula is I know X, but nevertheless Y. So you have these other languages, maybe small talk with everything's an object, Elixir, everything's about data transformations or pipes. You've got Factor, everything's a word or maybe Combinator or something like that. And Erlang, everything's a process, concurrency-oriented programming. And I've got references, again, in the paper for the designers of these languages and the communities saying this stuff. So I'm not just making up. An interesting, so a telltale sign of someone treating a language or an abstraction within a language as a fetish, you go to a programming conference and they will, let's pick on Elixir. They'll put something like the main abstraction, so it's a pipe within Elixir. It could be an object within Smalltalk. They'll display on the projector, hey, look at these 4 pipes, right? And they'll look at the crowd and then want you to have some type of response, like, isn't that elegant or something like that. And then they'll solve a problem, and then it'll end up being adding another object or another, whatever the abstraction is. So a pipe for in Elixir's example. All right, well, when they do that, you might say, if you're an advanced programmer, you might say, well, hey, can you solve all your problems with objects or pipes or processes, adding another process or whatever? And they're going to say, of course not. I know you cannot solve all your problems with an object. Nevertheless, they act like you can solve all your problems with a brand new object, with a brand new pipe, with a brand new data transformational process. And that's really, with it, when you're reading Lacanians or Zizek, a big part of his philosophy is using this definition of fetishism. So it's important to remember, I know X, but nevertheless Y, he repeats it a lot. Now we're going to get into the obsessive languages. The obsessive enjoys activity that forestalls the end result. Remember, obsessive activity is doing something in order to do nothing, right? So you've got static type systems, boilerplate, or even case sensitivity. Doing some type of thing kind of forestalls the end result. Let's pick on Haskell a bit. So within Haskell, that's the only community I know of where they'll say, when you finally get something to compile and run it, it actually works the way you thought it should. The first time you run it, it actually works. I don't know of another community where they say the first time I run a program, it actually does what I wanted it to do. And that's kind of a testament to the amount of reasoning that you've got to do in the type system before you get something running and getting something compiling. The Haskell static type system is known for being very powerful, but actually kind of hard to learn. It's actually a kind of, within mathematics, it's called category theory. Scala very similar. It has a very powerful static type system. And you have the same type of development. And remember, all these languages, you can approach Scala like a hysteric. We're going to learn about that in the next slide. But if you're approaching it, it lends itself to developing with doing all of your reasoning within the type system. A critique of the static type systems would be something along the lines of, when I'm doing my development, when I reason about my problem, I want to reason about it in the programming language. I don't want to reason about it in the type system. I don't want my edge cases in the type system. I don't want my bugs in the type system because they're kind of hard to reason about. But, so let's talk a little bit about Java, right? Java and boilerplate. So for Java, it can take 30, 50 lines to just do the most simple thing. So like hello world or something like that, right? But there's a certain amount of enjoyment within that you can get from maybe creating 1,000 lines of code in one day. And it's for a great deal of it's just boilerplate, but committing it and saying, I did a lot of work today, right? So that's boilerplate, ceremony, and wrestling with the syntax. The type system in Java is not as, well, I would say is not as powerful as Haskell and Scala. So you're wrestling with all of that, and you can kind of see this with the people that are learning Java in college. They'll come back, and after they did all this wrestling, they finally got something to work. They're like, great, but it really wasn't that much. Same thing with basically with C++. You can use it there'll be a lot of boilerplate there. All right, so let's talk about Go. I almost had Go as a hysteric language, but the developers of Go, the designers of Go, which is a language made by Google, essentially, they made it for large software architectures like Google, what Google has. And what's interesting is they said that they don't like type hierarchies. They don't like types inheriting from other types or rules that are dependent on other rules. They like a flat rule system or hierarchy or interface. So the interfaces for Go are flat, and they allow you to reason but not have to do, in their opinion, not have to do too much reasoning ahead of time before you get something working. So there's an essay, a famous essay called Worse is Better, and you can, if you go back to the beginnings of Unix, there was this back and forth of how they should develop it. And there was the MIT style and the New Jersey style. The New Jersey style was the worst style, okay? And what happened was, within that, they erred on the side of the internal code base being nice. But the boundary, if you will, for the non-programmer, the boundary or the interface or the way you call it, it didn't have to be correct or perfect. That was the New Jersey style and ended up winning, right, for people, and because people started contributing more to Unix or whatever. The MIT style was the boundary being correct. If you have to err, the boundary would be correct. The internals might not be something that would be as maintainable or correct. And this kind of Go is kind of the revenge of the MIT style, actually, with microservices. With a microservice, you want your boundary to be correct because you don't necessarily care about a programmer coming in and modifying your internal code for the microservices. So that is why that is an obsessive slide. So now we've got the hysterical languages. Right, so the hysterical language, the delivered code as the object of desire, is never good enough because of aesthetic reasons or reasons of beauty. That kind of causes endless refinements to the code base, right? Capturing elusive domain jargon always just seems right around the corner. So an example would be if you could take the domain of accounting. You can take some words that an accountant would use, like cash flow statement, income statement, invoice. Those words, the person who's preoccupied with domain and trying to implement that, they try to create what's called a ubiquitous language between what's programmed, right? The words literally in the source code are going to be shared with what comes out of the accountant's mouth, right? That's this ubiquitous language. And these refinements, they move towards trying to get things to look that way more and more, right? So the Ruby community likes to do what they call DSLs, domain-specific languages, which are shared in the sense of this ubiquitous way. Now, there's two extremes for a hysterical language. The first extreme is continuous modification of the definition of the language to represent any aesthetic, right? So continuous of the modification of the definition. That's why I have C# in this category. When closures, not the language, but the abstraction, when it became popular, maybe 2005 or so, they bolted, or 2007, they bolted closures onto C#. It didn't have the capability to do a closure, but the designer has said that with closures and other things, he wants to be able to encompass whatever new trend comes his way. And he likes that kind of thing. And it seems like, and then another example would be when functional programming became a trend, they bolted that onto the .NET platform, which is the platform that the compiler for C# and made it and called it F#. So there's this hope within the .NET community, and I've done a bunch of .NET development, that you can, whatever trend comes along, you'll be able to implement that trend because the people that design the language, they will refine it so that it can implement the trend. A critique of that would be Martin Fowler saying, okay, you implemented closures within C#, but none of your community uses closures. You made it in this cumbersome way, and you don't have the conventions, and you don't care about, well, I guess the craftsmanship would be probably why he says that why it's not implemented within C#. All right, so then you've got again the second extreme would be the bending of the language to implement the aesthetic. Again, I mentioned Ruby already. Let's take a look at Python. Python, the community, internal to the community and external community, look at the language and say, this is executable pseudocode. It's so nice to look at. You can almost read, it looks like as if you just wrote something out, but it actually works. It's actually working Python. And so it's great for people to learn. It's a great learning language. It's also great for advanced things. An interesting thing within Python, there's a saying of there's only one right way to do it. So if you implement something in Python and it's the wrong way, you're expected to refine it and make it the right way. And then you've got Prolog here. If you can imagine, Prolog is a logic language. Again, let's think of the accountant domain. There's a whole bunch of premises and logic within the accounting domain. And if you wanted to implement it in Prolog, you would build up all of these premises, and then you would get to the point to where you can tell this set of premises, you can query it, you can say you can tell it what you want it to do, but you don't have to tell it how to do that. And it's a very cool thing if you've ever done any logic programming. But again, there's a lot of refinements that go along with that. And now we're going to get into depression and melancholy. And I'm just going to use two quick examples. If you can imagine a husband and wife, okay? The husband dies, right? Now, that's a loss of the object of desire, all right? And the wife could very well fall into depression, or she could look at the lost object, the husband, and look at him with fondness. It can happen, it can go either way. Now imagine the husband and wife combo again, and the husband dies, and then someone comes up and says, oh yeah, but he was cheating on you the whole time, right? So now you have the loss, but you also have a loss of the loss. You have a loss of even the idea of the husband. Two losses. That's even worse. That's melancholy, and it's even worse than depression. Or it's also Jezik's definition of what romanticism is. So remembering a thing as if in a certain way, but it's not true. So, I mean, you can think of people have a romantic idea of what marriage was like 100 years ago, sometimes. Let's say it was great. Okay, well, women were property back then, so I don't know how great it could have been. Well, you've got Lisp, Scheme, and Smalltalk here, And there's people who write poetically about these languages. I'm talking about maybe for Lisp, Paul Graham, for Smalltalk, Martin Fowler. On the one side, for Melancholy, you've got them talking about current languages that they have to develop in and how they're not as good as these old languages, right? And they just wish that, Ruby had the capability of way that the elegance of the closures like Smalltalk did, or the metaprogramming, the macros for Lisp, that was, something that was developed 50 years ago, and now languages are just caring about that. That's a statement of Paul Graham. That would be Melancholy. And then on the romantic side, when they're talking poetically about the language for Paul, like Paul Graham, he talks about Lisp like it was the best thing ever. Well, but it's not necessarily true. None of these languages ever became mainstream, right? And then, for instance, Lisp never really had a great concurrency story, right? When dealing with multiple processes and stuff like that. So, but when he talks about it, he doesn't really mention that so much. And so that's a romantic view of a language. Now, and I didn't say this, but either for depression and melancholy, obsessional can fall into depression, obviously. They can fall into melancholy. Hysteric, all the other structures can fall into this. I would say Lisp is a hysteric language, but at this point, it's in melancholy. So here's a conclusion. If early speech acts have an effect on how our enjoyment is structured, then we should be able to locate patterns and biases in our decisions. People have different ways of enjoying, which is one motive for diversity of languages. We can appeal to the influence of psychoanalytic structures when explaining our desires are pulled in irrational directions. And just to summarize, psychoanalytic structures allow us to critique programming languages and communities, account for some of the diversity in languages, design new languages with a target audience in mind, and increase our tolerance for other language communities. So let me open it up for questions. I hear you, but I'll repeat your question, I guess.
It's on now. I hear my breathing. It's creepy. Early on, I was hoping you'd cycle back to this. You mentioned the possibilities of using a hysterical language from another standpoint, but you weren't putting any value on that. Is it a good thing, a bad thing, a neutral thing?
Well, remember, Lacan doesn't believe that, psychoanalysis is for your well-being. So it's whatever. None of these structures are good or bad, and that's a big part of it. For instance, I didn't say this, but so perversion could be described for black hat hacking and white hat hacking. There's you could say, the dysfunctional kind of perversion. Black hat hacking falls into that category. White hat hacking would be, manipulating the rules, but you're doing it in such a way, you're getting enjoyment from it, but you're doing it in such a way that it benefits everyone. So, you can look at it. I personally I'm probably in real life, I'm probably an obsessive, but I like Ruby, I like refining things, but and I have to program in JavaScript all the time. So I approach JavaScript definitely like I'm obsessive. I'm writing tests for everything. So I'm forestalling and writing the tests all the time. That would be an example of the obsessive, and I think that that's a good combo, but it's kind of up to you. It's really supposed to be a way of defining reality, and you can use what I've spent almost 3 years, 2-3 years, doing philosophy meetup groups about Lacan and Jezik, and I found that these things that I've defined in here, he doesn't define those. He just expects you to know the psychoanalytic terms. If you understand these terms, just the categories and the names, then you can use it and read Jezik and then come up with your own kind of way of being and looking at reality or whatever. Yeah. Any other questions? Here we go.
So,
what? Wait. That's all right.
the more languages I read the presentation, the more I was thinking about something. Here you're ranking languages based on the major traits that people display when they choose a specific language. Like you rank the language amongst fetishism, masochism based on the main traits that people will display when they speak about this language. But that may not be really representative of the trait of some users that knows a lot of languages and just decide to use one because any setup is present and allows him to code right now. And then you may feature different behavior than the one I'm very not clear.
So I heard you say that, programmers can have multiple traits or multiple features or be able to command multiple features across multiple languages. Is that what
what is the part of the language that helps you to classify them in one part versus another one? Is it the main?
Well, for this, it's the way that I was trying to use this or explain this it goes back to enjoyment. So what is it that you can see what is it that the community talks about is, what they enjoy? And enjoyment is this weird definition. It's not. So, there's the hysteric. One side, the hysteric, remember, they experience disgust, right? That's a big motivator. They also, as far as beauty, right? So a hysteric will look at some code and say, it's ugly, right? I don't like that. I don't like that PHP code or whatever. And that would be what they're preoccupied with when they look at PHP or whatever. But they, like I said, the obsessive, they enjoy forestalling over and over, the obsessional activity. So I don't know if that answers your question. That's the categories.
The question was not really well said, but that's exactly the answer.
Okay.
So the question was, how do you rank languages? And the answer was based on the way the biggest part of the community enjoy speaking the language and speaking.
Yeah. Okay. And you had one?
Yeah, so my question builds off of his, which is, if you look at a polyglot, and, somebody who claims that, this language is the best way to express what I'm trying to do, how do you reflect on that, given what you've just talked about here? Is it that, they kind of are just have versatile personalities, or?
Well, the vocabulary they use would probably betray them. So if they start talking about how they think something looks beautiful, that's probably how they're going to address things. If they start talking about safety a lot, if you guys know Gary Bernhardt, he talked a little bit about this subject, but he's preoccupied with safety, with JavaScript. That's what he thinks is interesting when he talks about the failings of JavaScript. It's all the safety part. But I don't see him talking so much about the beauty side, which is what somebody from the hysteric side would be doing. So it really, the way to do it would be to look at what their vocabulary would be.
So your premise is that polyglots are biased in one of these directions?
Yeah. Well, so obsessive with traits of perversion, you can have traits of another one, but you'd have a primary. That's what Lacan's argument is that you're going to be one of these. So in reality, we're probably, the guys mostly are probably obsessive, but I like to program as a hysteric, so I can't say. And they're two sides of the same coin, it's obsession and hysteria, so. No, go ahead.
So it seems to me there's a sort of distinction here between whether the fetishism or whatever is inherent in the language or inherent in the community that practices the language, or is there what's the relationship between the two? Is there a part that maintenances one begat the other, so the structure of C is such that it attracts this community, or is the community shape the language?
Somebody created the language, so they're going to have, and when I use the term the rules, there's like 5 or 10 synonyms for that. There's the law, there's the big other, what what Freud called the superego, all this stuff like that. But when someone creates the language, there's this rules and how bogged down are you with the rules, you know? So that's how I look at that. He's preoccupied. The prohibitions that you get in the early speech acts, they're supposed to have this massive effect on you and how you view enjoyment. So it's just analogous to that. Anybody else? Oh, one more or two more? Okay. I think he says we got time for one more. Okay. You can see me after.
My question is really, by the way, the most fantastic talk. But brilliant. Well done for not being scared of going into too much detail for this talk. It's really, really, really interesting.
Oh, thanks.
My question was around how you can get incompatibilities between different types of coder, of programmer. So, speaking from experience, I used to manage somebody who I now understand was a hysterical programmer, and get extremely frustrated when she would spend hours refining things.
Oh my gosh! By the way, don't call anybody any of these terms. Don't do that. Yeah, let's keep it abstract. I forgot to say that. Yeah. Keep going. Go ahead.
So, like I said, would you give any advice then about how you can make two different types of people work together like that?
So you said that you had two examples of programmers.
So if you've got somebody such as myself who just wants to ship something, get it done, get it out there, is less worried about the intricate details of something, and then you're working with somebody who is much more obsessive about the way something that is written and is constantly trying to go over and make it even better.
Yeah, well, see, don't. Well, it's nuanced, right? It's when we use the word obsessive, thinking about something, and there's refining something over and over, and that could be getting it out and refining it. Then the obsessive in this definition is forestalling. So it's not quite ready yet. It's not quite ready yet. It's not safe enough or whatever. So both of them, you can almost treat obsessive as with a from a beauty standpoint as well. So I don't know if I get your question. If you look at it that way, how is it that you get them to work together? Is what you're saying? Yeah. I don't really know the answer to that question. Yeah.
Probably start with understanding.
Yeah. It's interesting. Obsessive and hysteric are kind of cats and dogs anyway. So you'd be solving the problems of the world if you can do it. So. All right, I think that's it. Thanks, guys.